Hey everyone, how's it going? Joshua Gibson here with the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. I am joined by my special guest, Dr. Mike Israetel. How you doing, Dr. Mike?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. And I'm sure every single person that's going to listen to this has an idea of who you are, but maybe just give a little more of a detailed background, your education, and things you find pertinent.
You know, I'm so grand in every way that I refuse to be summarized by mere words. I think visual representation would be doing me much more justice, probably like an audio-visual seminar sort of situation to really get the full effect of who I am. But I'll sink down to the plebeian level. And so anyway, I don't know. I'm nothing special. Dr. Mike Israetel, the doctor, is because I have a PhD in Sport Physiology from East Tennessee State University, where I learned how to take good athletes and make them better. And I have been a professor for several years at various institutions in the United States. And my interest is sports science, advanced sport nutrition, sport training. I am a co-founder of and head science consultant for a company called Renaissance Periodization. We do a lot of writings and templates and all this kind of stuff, helping people get in shape. And I am a bodybuilder and Brazilian jiu-jitsu grappler in my quote-unquote free time. So I'm on both the practical side and the scientific side to some extent.
Okay, great. And so what exactly drove you to this field in particular? Because it is slightly niche-y, even though it's growing for sure with the introduction of CrossFit, but still small nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. You mean what drove me to pursue my education in the field, or what drove me to be a participant in
both
athletics? A unresolved childhood desire to become powerful. It's actually not a joke. And I wanted to learn everything I could about being strong, and that's since morphed to everything I could about being big, and everything I could about being a great fighter. And I watched through some combination of various factors, probably including watching a little bit too much Dragon Ball Z when I was a kid. Never got over that stuff, so I'm living the dream, trying to make humans into machines as much as possible. So it's about as good of an answer as I can give there.
Awesome. I think Dragon Ball, at least for myself, was highly influential. I can still recall just binge watching the original Dragon Ball for hours on end. It was a great time.
Hell yeah, man.
So what exactly are your plans going forward, maybe with Renaissance and then competitive aspirations?
Yeah, so as far as going forward, this is an announcement I have yet to make on Facebook, but I made it on a couple podcasts so far, is I will no longer be involved formally in the university setting as a professor going forward into this next semester. And my work is now full-time with Renaissance, and that means I'll be writing a whole lot more books, a whole lot more articles. I'm luckily being able to produce more video content. I'm going to be producing basically an equivalent to a university course at RP, just video courses and lectures, and it's going to be way cheaper than a university. And if you're interested in having a pedigree but you want knowledge, it's going to be super cool. So that's going to be what's going to be happening for the next several months to hopefully to years on the production side. And as far as competitively, I do jiu-jitsu competitions every now and again, and I work with a coach. I do a lot of private sessions. His name is Josh Vogel. He's gifted jiu-jitsu coach, and we're transforming me into a dangerous person. And on the bodybuilding side, the plan is to spend the next year and a half to get bigger, inconveniently bigger. So, and then after that, we're going to work on getting leaner and trying to bring something to the stage that doesn't look like total shit like I'm used to. So.
Okay. And just a few questions on that. Was there anything in particular that kind of drove you away from the academic setting, or was it just to build more of the company?
So it's mostly to build more of the company.
Okay.
At some point, RP is so big, and we can reach so many more people through RP. Like, I'll put it this way: if I was a really, really good professor at an institution, but I did nothing online as far as outreach, I would have never been on this podcast. Your viewers have never heard of me. I could be doing great work, and no one would have ever heard of me. Um, Now that I'm reaching out to, potentially thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe not, if more eventually people, then I can simply educate more people, and more people benefit from the knowledge I've accrued and the ways of thinking that I'm able to teach. So I think it's just better for everybody if I'm not involved in just the university setting alone.
Right, and that makes sense. Now, as far as someone kind of deciding if they'd rather pursue an academic path or just kind of taking all of the information online, what would be your recommendation there?
Well, if you're involved as a hobby, I think there's really needless to go to school. If you're involved in it as a professional and you want to help others, I think school has some pretty serious advantages. So I would at least consider some schooling, and then the depth and extent to which you want to learn and the extent to which you want to contribute to knowledge is going to determine how far in school you go. So if you
Okay.
want to be a really good personal trainer, bachelor's degree is good. If you want to be a really good online coach and work at a distance with people and become a little bit more of a teacher of concepts, a master's degree is probably a good idea. If you want to really have a depth of knowledge that is um, so deep that you can make new connections and help science move forward, I think a PhD is where it's at. I wanted that, so I went all the way, but
Okay.
it doesn't have to be that way. If I wanted to just be a personal trainer, which is a great career I used to have, I would probably never have gotten anything outside of a bachelor's degree.
Okay. And just sticking sort of in the academic setting, I'd like to have a brief introduction to research, just to give listeners some context when they do happen to stumble across a study. Um, and a certain like phrase that you hear thrown around is evidence-based. Do you what exactly do you consider that to mean, or how would you define it?
Yeah, so evidence-based, and many other people have done this definition a lot more justice than I will currently. Evidence-based does not mean evidence-constrained like some people seem to believe. It means based. Um, it means that the foundation of your practice is formal scientific investigation. And what most of that scientific investigation is on basic physiological principles and how the body works, and as far as exercise and diet, recovering, adapting, etc. Some of that is direct studies of direct actual concepts. Most of it is just a baseline. You take that baseline and you take as much direct knowledge as you can, and then you expand upon it by introducing personal experience, informal evidence from other coaches and other athletes, and the intersection of all of those, including the intersection finally of what is best for that particular individual that you are working with, including yourself at the time, is practice. So it's got to be an intersection of formal scientific knowledge, less formal but nonetheless still very powerful knowledge from experience that many people, including yourself, have accrued, finally intersecting with individual needs and demands. I think that is really evidence-based practice. And it's not my term. I didn't come up with it. I think that's the definition, Alan Aragon and those fine folks use. And that means that science should be a basis, but should not be the exclusive domain. A lot of logical fallacy that is committed by people who want to be evidence-based but don't quite understand it is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So if someone says, but there's no data to support that, that is a very different statement than saying that there is data to say that that is wrong. So some people can say, well, I think training like this is cool. And if there's no data to say that that's wrong, and there's no physiological backbone to even guess that that's wrong, maybe a fine way to train. As long as you're doing the basics, you can get funky as long as it's not contraindicated by the data. So it's a really big, important distinction to make that a lot of people don't. So they'll say, why are you eating like that? And I'll say, well, this and that, I think this is a good way to eat. And they'll say, but there's no direct data on it. I'm like, that's true. If you only act direct data, you would never leave your house because there's no scientific study that's been conducted that if you don't leave your house, you're going to die of starvation. You've never been a subject in that study, and the sample size is externally valid to you. So there's some misinterpretation there. Science is a tool to make us be better guessers about how the world works. It is not some kind of pass-fail system where if you have it, you're perfect, and if you don't, you're mentally ill and you can't form any conclusions about anything.
Sure. So if we have a bunch of studies that shed some light on a certain way of training, maybe a certain way that we should program our training. How can we interpret those studies to make sure that we are drawing an accurate conclusion and that the studies inherently weren't flawed to begin with?
Totally. So, well, you have to consider two kinds of validity: internal validity and external validity. Internal validity is the subject sample size high enough to draw powerful conclusions? Is the study, essentially the study's precision, high enough to detect the kinds of differences that we would want to detect? So for example, if you have a study on muscle hypertrophy of two different modalities, one versus another, and you measure hypertrophy over the course of 2 weeks, you may conclude that there is no difference between the modalities because there is no scientific instrument that can measure hypertrophy that occurs over 2 weeks. It's too short of a time. It's like measuring two race cars by giving them 1 meter of acceleration and then stopping them and saying, well, they easily were just about as fast. Well, now hold on a second. We got to give them some time, some room to actually show their speed. So factors like that, internal validity, and there's a whole checklist that you can go through. We actually have I actually just delivered a course on our RP Plus Renaissance Periodization website for the actual checklist of internal validity and all the different parts. And then if a study is internally valid, the good news is there's kind of a silver lining. You don't usually have to do all this yourself. Most journals, when they actually publish studies, they allow them to go through peer review. That means they're at least not the worst, least internally valid studies of all time. Usually it's pretty decent. So then you have an issue of external validity. External validity is not something that journals really referee much. And external validity is, okay, who do these results actually apply to? Because in a quite technical, you'll appreciate this, philosophical sense, the study really only literally for sure applies to the individuals that were in it. So when we're saying that, gain 8 pounds of muscle doing this kind of exercise, that means, Jim Anderson, subject 1A, gained 8 pounds of muscle. Everyone else, we're extrapolating. The degree, the confidence of that extrapolation matters on a couple of things. No less than one of those things is how similar is the population being studied, the sample being studied, to the population we are trying to apply the data to. A huge confounder that is persistently present, ever present, will continue to be present for years to come in exercise and sports science research, and that is very often, not always, but very often ignored, is the fact that almost all research is done on untrained subjects, and almost everyone reading that research and trying to figure out how it fits into their workout plan is pretty well trained. Some different things happen between trained and untrained individuals, and if you're not careful of that external validity stumbling block, you can come to all sorts of really interesting conclusions that will be completely wrong. So when you're looking at studies, you're asking if they're internally valid, to what extent, is asking if they're externally valid, and to what extent. And the last thing you're asking is how many studies are there on that subject, and what is the consensus of the evidence that the studies have presented. Because 1 or 2 studies means pretty close to dick as far as what you can extrapolate about what's happening. We have very little work left to do at Renaissance, which as far as Nick Shaw, my boss, is concerned, is never. But someday when I get some more free time, I am going to make an Olympics of single study conclusions, where I will ask maybe Facebook followers to find studies that were one-offs in fields in which the situation went completely the other way. Included in this, just who comes to mind, is the idea that vaccines cause autism. That was one study. And if you thought one study meant a lot, boy, did you have another thing coming when the next 150 studies indicated that that was not the case. So if you've got just a couple of studies, the most you can say about a subject is that this is a pretty interesting hint. One study, I would say, so backing up a little bit, one study on a subject in a certain direction is what I would call hypothesis-generating study. It really tells us, ooh, interesting. I wonder if this is how it actually works. Something like 5 to 10 studies is like, this seems to work in the following fashion. Something like, depending on the field, 10 to 30 studies is like, wow, things really seem to be working like this. And then when you get into the dozens or hundreds of studies, it is quite clear or, very clear that things very likely go like this. And when you get into something like aspartame, sucralose, artificial sweeteners that have been studied into the thousands of studies, you can say really cool things like, it is almost certainly the case that they are safe, or whatever else you draw from the studies. So we take internal validity, external validity, study number, volume, we integrate all of those, and we can find out what the general consensus of the scientific research is on a subject and be relatively confident about it. Good news is we don't have to do that ourselves, because that's what comprehensive reviews of the literature and meta-analyses do for us. Do they do a perfect job? No, but damn, they do a really good job. So that's where I would start. If I didn't have a real big science backing, I would start by reading comprehensive reviews of the literature, or even better, the documents we have as a society that are made of agglomerations of comprehensive reviews, which are called textbooks. Textbooks are written based on comprehensive lit reviews. Start reading a textbook. You'll learn a ton of shit. And if you really get brainy, you can start reading the comprehensive reviews. And if you really get brainy, you can start reading individual studies.
Okay.
Ta-da! Sorry for talking for so long.
No, that was phenomenal. Super thorough, and it actually just kind of answered a lot of questions that I had. And now a concept I hear commonly thrown around is this this whole idea of responders and not responders to training, and in research as well, because obviously the research is publishing means, so they're going to have outliers on both ends. Is there a certain basis for responding to a training protocol or not responding? And do you have an idea what that basis would be?
Yeah, so, Brad Schoenfeld, if you get him talking about, probably just through the screen, he gets really passionate about it. This question's brought up. I've been around him, this question's brought up, and I'm like, oh God, I kind of shift over in my seat. The idea, the nomenclature is not a good start of responders versus non-responders. If you're familiar with statistics, most natural phenomena occur on some kinds of probability curve, whether it's a chi-squared curve or more likely it's a normal distribution. Usually most natural phenomena are normally distributed or have some kind of distribution that resembles normality to some extent, which means most people are somewhere in the middle area and fewer people on the outsides, and there's plenty of outliers in both directions. Response, adaptive response to any training stimulus, as a matter of fact, response to damn near anything, almost always shows a normal-like distribution, which means that if we say that we give people a weight training protocol and the average gain is 5 pounds of muscle, most people probably gain between, 3 and 7 pounds of muscle. And some people will gain as much as 10, but very few. They're, ultra responders or super responders. Mega responders. I'm just kidding. I could just keep going all day with the superlative suffixes or prefixes rather. But if you think of any, let me know. And then there's people on the other end. Pico responders or nano responders. I'm getting ahead of myself. But so they're in the really bad femto responders. I mean, my God, there's barely detectable. So there's people who maybe gain 2 to 3 pounds of muscle, and every now and again, you'll find people that gain what we'd like to call a statistically undifferentiable amount of muscle, which is they might have gained like a pound, but our study only detects in pound increments, right? That's our machines can't detect anymore. So we say, look, it's like coming back to the sport physiologist after the study, and he shows you results, and you're like, so how much muscle did I gain? And he's like, it is by no means clear you gained any, but you could have lost some, and we still wouldn't be able to tell you that. But the good news is you didn't lose a lot. And some individuals have even been detected with training intervention as losing muscle. They actually have a net loss from the study, which I can comment as to why that happens most of the time. But in general, this idea of responders and non-responders is a little bit of a false dichotomy. We should really look at it as differential responders. And some of those people will be close to zero, yes. So in the real world, I think this translates to you're going to train clients in a certain way or train yourself. Your guess is that you're going to gain some kind of gains on average, but you really never quite know until you try. And then collect good data, figure out what's going on. And if you really aren't gaining, you got to switch it up, try something else, reanalyze the situation. And if you're really gaining super well, rock on.
Right. And that's looking at it from the perspective that it's just about muscle growth. I'm sure they responded to the training by, having certain health markers kind of improve, just in a different
So I
way.
totally. Well, I can speak to that as well. When you have studies on health changes from exercise interventions, you'll also have people who didn't respond to the health markers. Their health markers sometimes have no changes, and sometimes very rarely get worse. Okay, and I guess it's good time now to speak about why people can get worse from training. It's not that their physiology is broken most of the time. It's not like God played some kind of sick joke on them and like, overload principle for you is the underload principle. Here's it, check that out, lottery of life, right? No. So most of the time, what's happening with these individuals, if you really peer into it, is they will already be in an incredibly stressful situation and grossly under-eating for whatever reasons. The addition of further training takes them beyond their ability to recover, is a net proteolytic, right, protein breakdown effect, and they get worse. It's one of those situations where if someone was already running 70 miles a week as a marathon runner, and aliens came down to Earth and they kind of considered 70 miles to be just like normal moving around, and they took a bunch of marathon runners and added another 70 miles to their training, they would find that most of them are negative responders, that they get worse. And they'd be really confused, like, what the hell is going on? So the sum total of stressors sometimes is what pushes people over the edge and gives them negative responses. It's usually almost always not a case of the fact that exercise is actually bad for them. It's the fact that exercise combined with a really, really poor diet and or really, really poor stress, poor sleep, high levels of work effort somewhere else, etc., that confluence can end up really screwing people over, and they can take a couple steps back.
So would that be more likely with an untrained population or a trained population?
Negative results are more likely with a trained population because you can juxtapose all of that to a higher minimum effective volume. Trainers that have been doing it for a while have a minimum threshold much higher than 0. So, you give someone a 1 set, 2 sets a week, they'll grow and add muscle and get better at sports. If they've been training for a while, anything less than 6 to 8 or maybe even 10 sets a week is really just not detectable. For those individuals, if you have trained individuals, it's actually really easy to describe why they could regress on a certain plan, because the current dosage of training, the amount of sets and reps, etc., for trained individuals could very well be below some of their maintenance volumes. So the volume of which they have to do to maintain their gains could be 12 sets a week. And they're on a program that's reasonable, but it's 8 sets a week. And they're literally just going to be losing slowly the entire time. And you're going to say, oh my God, exercise doesn't work for them. Nonsense. Exercise works for them. They just need more of it. So that's another way in which that kind of error could come into effect. So even when we look at this non-responder, so to speak, first of all, there's very few of them, and second of all, there's usually, almost always, something going on short of exercise just isn't the thing for them.
Okay, awesome, and that was a phenomenal answer. Now, switching gears to training a little bit, I would like to introduce some definitions before we kind of dig into it. So, if you could just differentiate between programming and periodization, and maybe give some examples of each, so listeners have an idea of what you mean.
Can you repeat that? Periodization and what else?
Just programming.
Yeah. So the definition of programming is what kinds of volumes, intensities, and frequencies you're using to accomplish your goal, usually conceived of in the medium term on a mesocycle level. Periodization is a concept of how you structure mesocycles together to form a macrocycle. It is a much more complex endeavor, but one which attends in general principles rather than exactitudes usually.
Okay, and I noticed that a lot of your writing and a lot of your training typically focuses on a block or like sequential type of periodization. Do you notice that is probably the most optimal way to train, or are there other methods that are just as useful?
I think, that there are physiological processes that are meaningful that occur on several week to several month long timescales. Fatigue accumulation from a program that begins at a minimum effective dose usually takes weeks to months to get to excessive. That is probably the best reason why we think of things in those kinds of periods, because something has to be done about that fatigue at some point. Adaptation to various training modalities and they're becoming less effectual also usually falls on those time scales. The alteration of cortisol to testosterone ratios also usually falls on those time scales. So there are several time scales in which it's very, very useful to think. The microcycle is one of those for sure, about a week. The day is for sure one. The session is for sure one. And then after that, it's the mesocycle. And of course, the macrocycle is about a year, anywhere between half a year and a year of training. So I think physiological realities demand that we have predictable re-alterations and readdressing of the same physiological comes and goes, these waves that come up. And that usually happens on the order of several weeks to several months, which is how long mesocycles are. So mesocycle structure is something that wasn't really as much invented top-down as it was discovered that you have to manage things real world on that level. You know, would I like a situation in which I could just fucking train for like 50 weeks, linearly improving everything? I would gladly break up with the mesocycle and say, mesocycle, you know, we've had great times. And at one point I thought I loved you, but, you know, I thought I loved you, but I lied. It's more than love I feel. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So in any case, yeah, you know, I'm not attached to the idea of mesocycle. It just is an unfortunate thing that keeps coming back to physiological realities. I'll make a really quick analogy here. It's more of an example of a corollary less than an analogy. I feel you appreciate that being philosophically backgrounded. So meal frequency. You know, why do we think in terms of meals as these several, if it's these things we do within several hours of each other? Can we conceive of feedings as continuous? Or can't we conceive of feedings as once a day? Well, good luck, you know, like you just get hungry every couple hours, right? And why do we get hungry? Well, because, you know, most average meals that don't stuff us to the point of wanting to vomit but fulfill our hunger just take that many hours to clear the gut and get into the blood and digest and get into the cells, and then we get hungry again. So just the same way there are physiological processes such as fatigue accumulation and overload presentation that have to be attended to that recycle, just like a meal recycles every 3 to 6 hours, they recycle every several weeks to several months, depending on how you construct things.
Okay, so if we're looking at constructing a program from a block periodization method, and we're training for hypertrophy, then strength, and then power, what sort of reps, sets, and maybe even percentages would we be looking at for each different adaptation? So starting with hypertrophy, what would our training look like?
Well, hypertrophy is easy. Bro, you just got to do everything that you can, man, and sky's the limit, and you just got to believe to achieve. Is that a sufficient sports science answer?
Yeah, we should train to failure too, right?
Of course, bro, you got to like walk to failure to the gym. You got to like walk around the block enough to where your legs don't work, then your workout starts, bro. Anyway, so hypertrophy recommendations. It seems that most individuals benefit from training a body part anywhere between 2 and 4 times a week, overloading training 2 to 4 times a week. For most people, there are certainly some exceptions I can address if needed, but I think you know, only if you'd like. The total volume should probably be about anywhere between 10 and 20 on average, maybe 10 and 25 working sets per week, probably starting at the lower end of that and going up. Certainly some individual variation there as well. The proximity to failure of those sets should be probably less than 5 or less than 4 reps away from failure in all sets. And again, I would think increasing that proximity to failure as the mesocycle progresses, eventually going to failure or close in the last microcycle before deloading. And then the repetition ranges, you can conceive of them as well as percentages of 1RM, but I think so few people think of percentages of 1RM, and it's such a like a dirty ecological measurement, right? You're not going to like, you know how many fucking reps you did, but you're not going to count all this fucking weight. So you're like, you know, what's my squat currently? Let me get this calculator out. What's 4 plates divided by this and that? So hypertrophy is probably best accomplished, and I got to be really specific about how I say this, an average rep range of 8 to 12 reps, but I think there's value in going up to 20 to 30 reps on occasion. There is value in going down to as few as 5 reps on occasion, and depending on the individual and depending on the muscle group, and that is an exceedingly complicated discussion, but the average should be around 8 to 12 for most individuals, because that average is the one that gives you the best trade-off of weights heavy enough to get you full stimulus, but also weights light enough to allow the accrual of high volumes without these really crazy high fatigues. So for example, somebody could say, well, as long as we get a total volume in, sets times reps times weight, it doesn't matter how light or heavy the weight is. Well, if a weight's really, really light, there's probably some kind of growth it doesn't give you. That's been shown pretty clearly, especially for fast twitch muscle fibers and other things. And for sure, on the other end, if you try to do heavy doubles to get to a total volume equivalent to sets of 10, you will die before you get there. Or you might get there one session, you'll just die in your sleep overnight to get to the other one. So, and just to make sure that I'm actually being serious about some of this, you're just going to accumulate such a massive amount of fatigue. It's, in reality, what's going to happen is your fatigue accumulation is going to be so high in relationship to how much meaningful work you're doing that you're not going to be able to do much progressive overloading, because if you basically reach your maximum fatigue that you can sustain in the first week of training, your mesocycle is a week long.
Taking that understanding of how we would train for muscle hypertrophy, how would we transition to strength, and how long would it take those adaptations to kind of become realized, if that makes sense?
Yeah, totally. So with strength, the prescription is a little bit different. You're probably going to be training with between, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 15 working sets per week, usually. And the rep ranges are going to be more like anywhere between 3 and 6 reps on average, thus concomitantly heavier weights. And anything, within, again, 3 or 4 reps from failure. 2 to 4 sessions per week, although with strength, because nervous systems take a little longer to recover and overload has to be a little bit more meaningful, it is more difficult. More like 2 to 3 overloading sessions for most people, and some people even 1 overloading session per week is good enough. And, there are some ways to do the transition that are better than others. I think that if you're training for hypertrophy with an eventual plan to use that muscle to be stronger, you shouldn't train with any reps that are much higher than 10, because then the nervous system qualities and other features of the musculature end up being very different and take a longer time to transition to actually being useful in strength. But if you train with anywhere between 6 and 10 reps for hypertrophy, then it's a pretty quick transition. You go from doing sets of 8 on average to sets of 6 on average. And then usually that means that, when you've gained size, it takes a couple of weeks for you to get used to the new poundages and maybe the new lifts. So I would say within 2 to 3 weeks, most people are going to start to really feel the benefits of their size gains. That's for like an average size gains you would gain over 3 to 4 month period before transitioning. If you've been gaining size for a couple of years and then you transition to strength, you're going to hit all-time PRs on week 1, but that's from a lot of size gains. So I would say usually in a couple of weeks you'll start to feel the added muscle benefiting you, and over the next several months your body is going to relearn how to use that new muscle even better and even better and even better, so you will continue to get stronger.
Okay, and then transitioning to a power or peaking phase, would it be a similar kind of protocol with dropping the reps and sets?
Yeah, so the peaking phase is not sport specific. It depends on what you're peaking for.
Okay.
But power is the training of force times velocity, and that's a different quality altogether. If you're talking about Olympic weightlifting, there's a little bit of a different way to peak for that versus peaking for powerlifting versus peaking for shot put or sprinting. But generally speaking, peaking involves a further reduction of volumes, raising the intensities very close to maximum, and in the powerlifting would be like sets of 1 to 3. And the total working sets per week that are overloading is now less than 10 usually, anywhere between 3 and 10. And after that, you're going to be doing, especially if you're more advanced, not all of your sessions are going to be overloading. Some are going to be light sessions designed to maintain technique and enhance recovery, and only maybe every other session or something is going to be overloaded. And the peaking process usually doesn't take very long, anywhere between 1 and 2 months. 2 months for very advanced people, 1 month or less for everyone else. And after a couple of weeks, you're going to start to really, really feel like those weights are going well. And after a month to 2 months, you're going to feel that you have the best combination of the general strength that you've built up in your strength phase and the specific technique of exerting yourself maximally against heavy loads. At that point, you undergo a tapering phase of several days to several weeks. You compete, and win for God and glory and country or whatever else people compete for.
Okay, so if we're looking at putting in some type of overreaching protocol, I've heard anecdotally from a few sources that like anytime they try to double their training volume in that peaking phase, it never tends to go well. Is there a certain nuance to it, or is it just person specific?
Yeah, so it definitely there's a lot of person-specific stuff. You don't want to double it for long. It should just be 1 microcycle. And, anyone can really survive 1 microcycle of doubled volume. Doing it longer is not a good idea. And then the next microcycle should be relatively normal in training volume. You should still feel like shit. And then the microcycle after that is when you really reduce volumes and intensities, peak out, and hopefully get your best results. For some individuals, doubling of training volume is excessive, and they would benefit much more from something like multiplying it by a fractional amount, 1.5 or 1.25 the normal volume. But for most individuals, they're going to benefit from some amount of increase in volume while keeping intensity high in the weeks leading up to that.
Now, would you only recommend that right before a competition, or is it useful for a hypertrophy phase or some kind of strength phase?
In a strength phase and in a hypertrophy phase, that sort of elevated volume with what's called functional overreaching, overreaching for a purpose, that happens automatically at the last week of the accumulation phase.
Sure.
So that's already taken care of.
Okay.
In taper, it's special because we do it on purpose, not just to make better gains, but to literally exhibit our best possible performance about a week or so later. So I think all phases have them built in. The overreaching paradigm is just a little bit more meticulous in the last phase because there's more of an element of timing to it than there usually is.
Okay. And just a listener question we had sent in. In terms of daily undulating periodization, the concept of DUP, if you were to train multiple qualities, say have a day where you do sets of 12, a day where you do sets of 8, and a day where you do sets of 6, how would the body prioritize those adaptations, and which one would take precedent, and would you consider it an optimal way to train?
Depends on how much you separate out the rep ranges. Probably not an optimal way to train if you want to be a good performance athlete. Decent way to train if you want to be the most muscular person. But what ends up being prioritized is, I suppose, the total volume that you're training is really going to depend on hypertrophic adaptations. It's going to determine those a lot. And the variance in intensities doesn't really play much of a role in those. So if your weekly volume is sufficiently high to maximize hypertrophic adaptations, they're going to be doing really well. The thing is, as soon as your weekly volume is high enough to maximize hypertrophy, it's almost certainly too high to maximize strength outcomes. Put it another way, your days on which you do sets of 12 are so fatiguing, they really fuck you up for your sets of 6, and you're not able to perform or recover nearly as well from those as you otherwise would have. So what you end up doing is, if you mix hypertrophy and strength together, hypertrophic adaptations tend to predominate, and strength adaptations tend to be suboptimal. More so than hypertrophic adaptations, which will also take a hit, but not nearly as much. Similar thing can be stretched to all fiber type comparisons and all is sort of durational comparisons. So if you train a marathon runner in sprints and a sprinter in a marathon running, the sprinter is going to become much better at marathon running, but the marathon runner is not going to become much better at sprinting.
Sure.
They're still going to become pretty good at marathon running, though. So our bodies tend to transition fiber types better and adapt better to the volume of work much more than the specific kinds of adaptations we want out of the nervous system, which usually are occurring much better in the presence of a lower volume of work. So another example is if you try to get stronger and more powerful at the same time, Strength adaptations will be very impressive, power not so much. If you try to get big and powerful at the same time, power adaptations will be very unimpressive, but your size adaptations will be largely unaffected. And one of the reasons is fatigue. How much does power training really fatigue you? A couple of clean and jerks, a couple of snatches, not much. How much does bodybuilding training fatigue you? Oh my God. And how much is that going to interfere with your power training, both in training hard enough and fast enough to get better, and also collecting the benefits without interference from various pathways? Well, it's going to be a really big deal. So it tends to be that when we have interference, it's in the favor of the more endurance style, slower twitch on average modality.
So would you feel there's a benefit to maybe implementing some sort of like heavy single, heavy triple, or like a top set of 5 before the volume work? Or would that just kind of be extra fatigue on top of the training?
What's the purpose of that?
So say for a power lifter that's trying to maintain a certain level of strength.
Why are you trying to maintain a certain level of strength?
I don't know. I just see it commonly done. A lot of guys will...
Yeah, it's just wrong. People are addicted to always being strong. The cool thing about powerlifting meets is they're not actually at random. And as a matter of fact, they're the least random thing ever. You actually have to go out of your way to pay money and register for them. And if you feel that one is sneaking up on you that register for that you're not ready for, you can do this really cool thing. You call the promoters, they give you your money back. You can go take your money and register for another meet of theirs. So nobody gives a shit how strong you are 3 months before a meet. But what really matters then is how impressive are your sets of 6 to 8 or something like that. If they are impressive, that means you're carrying a significant amount of muscle mass and you're about to transition it into a significant amount of strength. 2 months out of the meet, nobody gives a shit how strong you are. But if your reps of 3 to 6 are really impressive, that means your level of general strength is very high. Once you make the appropriate timely transition to maximum strength, things will go very well for you. And then when you're maximal strength, then that's what matters, and that's the only time it really matters. So if you want to keep your strength during a hypertrophy phase, I think that's like trying to do a little bit of work over the weekend. It sure as hell ruins your weekend, but it's not really clear why you couldn't have just done that work when you're at the office and you're way better because you have double screens and your favorite mouse at the office and the copier of the printer is there. Sometimes you try to do work at home and you're like, fuck, I don't have anything that I need here. This sucks.
Right.
So everything interferes with everything. Things are best done in their own little compartments. Now, should there be some spread of abilities? Totally. Is it okay to do, a little bit of heavy work before your volume work? Sure, but that comes with some trade-offs. I think a better idea is to make sure your volume work isn't like sets of 15 that is completely alien and actually makes you much weaker. If it's doing sets of 6 to 10, you're not going to lose a whole lot of strength unless you're very advanced. And if you're very advanced, you already know that strength loss is incredibly temporary. It is basically a calculated reduction in your current strength to make sure to accrue more muscle mass. And because you're not pissing away time and recovery capacity doing singles and doubles for no damn reason, you have more effort and more recovery to put into the kind of work that's going to make you bigger. And then later, the kind of work that's going to make you stronger. And then later, the kind of work that's going to peak you out. And through that sequential process, add it up all together, and then you get the best possible result at the point of the meet. I remember Louis Simmons of Westside was fond of saying that he could have his lifters ready within 4 weeks of any time point to compete. And interesting response to that later was, why the hell is that a good idea? I mean, and not just why is it a good idea, it's a fine idea. Why is that necessary? Powerlifting, your meets sometimes a year in advance. So it's one of those situations where people say, I don't want to lose strength. A lot of it comes down to ego. It's like, well, so your 1RM is not as good as it used to be. Correct. So what's wrong with that? Well, I don't like it. Okay, well, is it bad for your long-term strength gains and meet results? No. So who gives a shit? Well, I don't like it. Okay, it's the same idea that people don't want to gain a little bit of body fat when they mass up and gain weight. If you don't want to gain any body fat, you'll never be good. And just the same way, people who don't want to lose any weight because they think they're just shrinking and getting smaller. So if someone says, you really need to lose some fat, it'll make you better at gaining muscle later. And they'll say, man, I really hate cutting because I'm not gaining any muscle during that time. Is there anything I can do to gain muscle during the cut? It's like, no. You do the cut, you don't gain any muscle during, but you don't lose any, and then it potentiates more muscle gain later. So this idea of phasic specificity, it's not a perfect idea in the sense that you have to be completely specific, but there has to be some really good reasons for you to violate the specificity principle, even to any extent.
I'd like to get your thoughts on a certain method that I think the guy's name is Matt Gary. I could be wrong, but He's a USA powerlifting national team coach, or was, and for all of his deadlifts, he only has his athletes do singles. So they might be doing 80% and do like 20 singles. What's your thought on that method? Because he claims that you get to practice the skill more.
Yeah, I think for the deadlift it makes some sense. So what I'll say is I think it's a good way to train, and it's one of the many good ways to train. I don't know if it's dominant or superior, but I can certainly see the logic, and I think it's sound logic.
Okay.
The logic is similar to how he described it. The deadlift, every time you have the squat, when you do one rep and you come back up, when you do your next rep, it's really just the same squat all over again. Same with the bench press, outside of doing high reps and then you start losing your arch and retraction. Sets of 5 or less, it's the same bench press. The deadlift, after the first rep, isn't the deadlift anymore. There is some tightness you develop from the eccentric that helps you in a reactive sense get the weight off the bar again. Your body structures are literally lengthened, the ones that can, including your finger grip on the bar. So now you're pulling from a higher hip position, right, and a more extended knee. It is now a different lift, just by a little, but enough to really fuck you over. So I would say that his method is someone could make the critique. I won't, because I think that there's definitely some validity there. Someone could make the critique about his method that I couldn't disagree with, that would say, listen, in the off season, when you're doing a total of 20 deadlifts per week, you can do sets of 5. It's not a big deal. There's time to clean up that technique differential later. But as you get closer and closer to the meet, his method becomes more and more correct, to the point that if someone's doing doubles before a meet and the deadlift without treating them like repeat singles, I think they're missing out to some extent. So I think that, especially several weeks away from your meet, every deadlift should be a single. It should be a restart, reset up, because that really lets you practice the skill. Not just practice the skill, but engage the right kind of musculature in the right ways, etc., that really is specific to the deadlift and will transfer most to performance. Because going back to our muscle gain discussion, nobody gives a shit that you did 3 reps with 900 pounds, bouncing the shit out of rep 2 and 3. It's the first rep that counts. So that's how you got to do it. All first reps as the meet approaches. And I think that there's some intermediate ways of training that are probably just as good as his. So if you don't want to do 20 singles, maybe in the off season, instead of doing sets of 8, maybe you'll just do sets of 4, but just more sets. It gives you an opportunity to reset more often, just not all the time. And then as you get closer and closer to the meet, maybe sets of 3, sets of 2, and then sets of 1, as opposed to for squats, you may actually do a set of 10 here and there, continuous squatting, and then eventually go down to singles.
Awesome. Super thorough answer. And these are just some questions that don't really fit into the context of what we were just talking about, but
no worries.
A little curiosity.
Sure.
I've heard about post-activation potentiation, or like having a potentiation set before you do like a working set. Can you kind of explain those concepts and maybe why they have some sort of benefit?
Yeah, so post-activation potentiation is kind of the second part of the warm-up process. The first part of the warm-up process is the literal warming up of tissues, the increased pliability of joints, etc. Part of that warm-up process is the development of more body awareness and the fine-tuning of technique, as far as the, neural firing becomes more precise to what you actually want it, versus the idea you've had in your head about what a squat's supposed to look like. But towards the end of warming up, as the weights get heavier and heavier, and in between heavy reps and heavy sets in your normal workout, every time you do a heavy weight, or you do a weight very quickly, anytime you exert yourself highly, and right after you stop, a recovery process begins. And during that recovery process, the nervous system becomes sort of starts to operate in firing patterns that are more efficient. It's sort of had a sample of this is what this looks like, and now it's starting to retool its directional firing of muscle fibers to, okay, this is what's going on. Let's make sure that next time it hits us, we're really good at doing it and responding to those force vectors exactly by supplying enough contractile force to the musculature. In addition to that, at the muscular level, you actually get a slight sort of movement of the direction of muscle fibers into the lines of pull that are exacted by the repetitions that you were just doing. So basically muscle alignment starts to change, and literally this occurs in a matter of minutes, and it just ever so slightly enhances force production in that exact movement that you're training. So in a general sense in the nervous system, again, there is a sort of disinhibition effect that occurs. You usually, when you lift heavy or try to jump really high, the nervous system kind of gives you a good hit, but it's like, we don't want to rip you in half, so we're not going to use everything we have available. As you do heavier and heavier work, your nervous system kind of goes, okay, all right, we're not dead yet. Let's open up a little bit more juice. So post-activation potentiation is when, after you've done a really heavy warm-up, you wait anywhere between, I believe it's 3 to 8 minutes for high-intensity effort. And somewhere there, for most individuals under most situations, there'll be a peak. And it's a pretty even kind of plateau such a situation, so it's not like exactly at 5 minutes and 30 seconds. There's your one little chance, and then Eminem style, you throw up all over mom's spaghetti, and it doesn't happen. But I think that, there's kind of a plateau there where anywhere between, 3 and 8 minutes, depending on the individual, they're actually going to be stronger or faster or more explosive because their nervous system and their musculature realigned, retooled, refined, and woke up more to the task at hand.
Okay, so basically to optimize that, you would just take the same weight you would be doing for the working set and take it for maybe a single and then take the rest?
There's a couple of ways to do that, and it's all based on the degree of potentiation and the ratio of that to the fatigue that you want. So for example, if you are doing really heavy training, sets of 1 to 3, the last potentiation rep you're going to have is going to be at maybe 90% of that eventual working weight, because that weight is so heavy it already gives you a really good potentiation response. But if you did a single, that would already be a working set. You know what I mean? So that's really highly fatiguing, and it already starts to take away from the rest of your workout. On the other hand, if you were doing sets of 10, and you really wanted to make sure your technique was good, the cool thing about potentiation is that once you're potentiated, you can maintain crisper, tighter technique because your body's not overwhelmed with how much weight is on your back or in your hands or what have you, and you can actually do a better job with technique because you feel sturdier and stronger, and you can pay more attention to the finer points. So in the sets of 10 or something like that, a rep or two with your set of 10 weight is good. It's a very good start, but some people may get even better advantages as far as the set going well if they go at 110 or 120% of their set of 10 weight. So let's say if you're using 100 pounds for sets of 10, you might do a double with 120. It's going to feel like total shit, right? You might do so before that you might do a single at 100, and then you go a double at 120 after 3 to 5 minutes, and then you go back to 100 and hit a set of 10. It'll be the best damn set of 10 you've ever felt in your entire life.
Awesome. That's excellent. I'm going to start implementing that right away.
Cool.
And on the flip side of that, looking to optimize the function of the nervous system, now we would be looking at the adaptive response of the nervous system. I have the concept monotonous training. So basically performing an exercise so much that your body becomes adapted to that exact movement. How could we go about removing an exercise to increase its response and then implementing it back in? What would a time frame be on that?
Yeah, totally. So, the time frame is on the order of months usually.
Okay.
So it takes months for you to become, to develop enough adaptive resistance to an exercise that it's worth the cost benefit to switch away. Because when you switch away, especially for strength training, when you switch to a new movement, you're going to be so neurally inefficient at that new movement that it's going to be difficult to overload. So it's just going to be awkward. For example, if you've never done a front squat before, and I have you do high bar squats all the time, and then they get stale, and I'm like, okay, front squats. The first couple of weeks of you front squatting is going to be a shit show. You're going to get very little out of it. You're actually going to get some pretty good hypertrophy because the angles of pull and stuff are different. But your strength isn't going to improve much because you're so unstable in that movement, your quads never really fully turn on and never really exert the kind of forces that lead your nervous system and musculature to become much stronger. So you got to be careful about how you do it. But when you're really, really stale, what you do is you take a derivative of that movement, same style of movement, but that is different enough to present a noticeably different stimulus. You begin doing that movement and probably do that movement for several months as well, a mesocycle or two. get some good gains from that movement, and then when that movement starts to become stale again, and or when it's time to transition into a competitive preparatory cycle where you have to go back to powerlifting moves or weightlifting moves, then you go back to the moves, and again, you ease back into them. So you don't want to assume that you're just as good as ever at them. You're probably going to be a little worse because your nervous system, its ability to kind of coordinate everything in that exact technique is going to fall off just a tad. So the reality of the matter there is you come back to it, ease in, do some maximal loading for a week or two, and then because of the novel presentation of stimulus and because you probably gained some musculature and some general strength from that other thing that you were doing for a while, you're going to start hitting new PRs, and that's is called variation or exercise deletion and replacement. Works pretty well. You just got to make sure not to do it right before a meet, because then you'll be really good at front squatting and no one gives a shit because you have to low bar squat at the meet and you're still awkward like a newborn deer with low bar squats.
Okay, and I want to be respectful of your time, so please let me know when you need to
I got another 20, 30 minutes.
Okay,
so
awesome. So now switching gears to a little bit on the nutrition side, I want to look at kind of the basics in terms of how the diet for each individual type of sport would change, maybe like an anaerobic sport, an aerobic sport, and then more like an extreme endurance sport. So for something like powerlifting, weightlifting, maybe even bodybuilding, what would an appropriate ratio of macronutrients be to optimize performance?
Yeah. I haven't thought about macronutrient ratios in a long time because we usually deal with gram per kilogram amounts. But I can summarize those and then kind of ghetto bastardize the ratios if you want.
Sure.
Mental math is not my forte. Because, I'm super smart, bro, or whatever. I need fucking calculus or it doesn't make any sense. I don't know. So anyway, so for strength power athletes, I would take bodybuilders a little bit off that list for now because I think they have some special considerations. But I think powerlifters, weightlifters, and strongman athletes, I think they're, on the high end of protein intake should be about 1 gram per pound of body weight per day. I think that almost certainly attends to all needs, and any more is really just pushing out fat and carbs you could be eating. I think that the minimum amount of fat should be about 0.3 grams per pound of body weight per week. So that's, per day. Jesus, per week. That would be, so for someone who weighs 200 pounds, it would be about 60 grams of fat per day. As long as you're getting that in, you're almost certainly meeting enough fats where any fats above that could be tasty and convenient and just fine and not interfere with performance. I think anything above that is anything below that is maybe not enough. Anything above that is totally fine. And then for carbohydrates are activity-based, volume-based. So if powerlifters, strongmen, weightlifters are in high volume training phases, lots of sets of 5 to 10 reps, etc., some individuals can benefit from up to 2 grams per pound of carbohydrate per day. So a 200-pound athlete could consume up to 400 grams of carbs per day. In lower volume training, that can be as low as 1 gram per pound per day. So someone who weighs 200 pounds could be consuming 200 grams of carbohydrate per day. And that doesn't mean it's as much of a recommendation. And we actually I'm rewriting the Renaissance diet book right now and being very clear on this. That's not as much of a recommendation as it is kind of like a minimum value to guarantee that you're doing a good job in meeting all your needs. Once you've met that sort of minimum value, any combination of fats and carbs is pretty equivocal between those. So as long as you got at least, let's say you're intermediately active, intermediate volume. So let's say you're getting a 1.5 grams per pound per day of carbohydrate. That means you're getting about 1 gram of protein per pound per day, 1.5 grams of carbohydrate, and 0.3 of fats. As long as you're getting those sort of values in for sure every day, you're going to have like 1,000 calories or something, depending on how big you are, of it could be any of the macros. And then at that point, if you're really, really, really interested in maximizing performance, I have more to say. But if you want to do a good job and be fairly well in the clear and still enjoy your life, that extra calories, once your needs have been met, can come from any combination of proteins, carbs, or fats. And of course, I think we all know the answer is carbs and fats, because who the fuck wants to eat more protein than necessary?
Right. So I'm kind of working off the assumption that for more aerobic sports, maybe like endurance running, that they would have a higher fat diet. Now, does that kind of change with the length of the event, or is that kind of like a blanket recommendation for all endurance athletes?
The research on high-fat diets and endurance is a little bit dubious at this point. It seems that ultra-endurance athletes, their performance can be characterized by, at most intents, a fast jog, and usually more like a slow jog, and sometimes like a climb or a fast hike. And this is where we're talking about, 50-mile, 100-mile, 200-mile races, things like that. Not on the cycle, on foot, which is completely insane. Those people are gods compared to all of us insects. But I would just imagine like a guy's running through a town and you try to mug him. And you're like, "What the heck? Give me your money." And he's like, "Hey man, I'm doing an ultra marathon." You're like, "What does that mean?" Be like, "I just ran 150 miles." Be like, "Jesus Christ, sir, take my walk." My God, thank you for not killing me with your eye lasers. Be like, "No problem. Change your life up, man. Sort your shit out." And he runs off into the wind and you're forever changed. Anyway, that's how I started sports science. But what the hell was I saying? Okay, so in individuals that are very long distance and very low intensity concomitantly, it's been shown that higher fat diets are okay tolerated. That does not mean they potentiate high performances. That means that higher fat's tolerated. Maybe once protein needs are met, half of the calories coming from fat and the other half coming from carbohydrate are okay because fats can be used as a fuel at low enough intensities. The thing is, anytime your average intensity or your determinative intensity, and what I mean by that is when things actually matter, how fast a sport going. So like the average intensity of soccer might be like a little bit like a jog, but what really matters is not how fast you walk when there's not shit going on. What matters is how fast you sprint, right? So determinative intensity is actually very high. For sports, for anything above a slow jog, carbohydrates are the predominant fuel by a long shot. So the best overall recommendation for endurance athletes is getting in as much carbohydrate as needed, and usually that amount is difficult to get in. So most endurance athletes could benefit from consuming more carbohydrates than they currently do, and it's always a daily struggle to consume enough carbohydrate as an endurance athlete, which means that if it's enough of a struggle and your training volumes are high enough, once you get your protein in, you want to keep your fats relatively on the low end and consume as much carbohydrate as you can, versus keeping your fats on the high end and struggling to fit your carbs into the calories needed.
Okay, so my question would be, where did this maybe misunderstanding come from that higher fat diets are more beneficial and everybody needs to kind of go on ketosis?
Yeah. People do low carb diets and they start to feel euphoric, and they start to try to get everyone else to feel the same thing, and they think they're onto something really big, and then the reality is that they're not onto something really big at all. So, and then a bunch of companies get involved in making money off this sort of thing, and it's this perpetuating cycle. And then some people, their appetite isn't nearly as high on low carbohydrate as it is on higher carbohydrate, because usually the kinds of foods they eat when they eat carbs are the kinds of foods that make you get rebound hunger all the time, snack foods and things like that. And those kinds of individuals tend to lose a lot of weight and keep it off on ketogenic diets. So then you have that camp further supporting companies, further supporting athletes, further supporting the ideas that high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets are good. When we talk about the direct literature and examination of performance with properly designed studies on good athletes, fat consumption is really a matter of how much can you get away with versus how much is going to boost your performance, unfortunately. So it seems that carbohydrates is still the dominant fuel for sport performance in most sports. And I think there's been a low-carb backlash, and my personal opinion and my reading of the literature is that it's mostly not evidence-based. Hey, look, I got to use evidence-based as a term in the podcast. There you go.
Awesome. So you said that bodybuilding was a little different. So where would that fit in?
Yeah, so bodybuilding is interesting because it is kind of a strength power sport, but the volumes are really starting to get similar to endurance because the total volumes include both cardio and weight training, and the weight training volumes are really kind of nuts. So with bodybuilding, and there's a couple of other special concerns when you're trying to really, really grow. The total insulin area under the curve, and this is an idea that's been formalized more by my coach and friend Broderick Chavez. Team Evil GSP is his website. He's got a podcast too. Everybody's got a podcast now, you people. But just kidding. So Broderick is a consultant of mine, and he helps me a lot with these kinds of thoughts on advanced nutrition. And he likes to point out that the more carbohydrate you eat, the more insulin you secrete. That is somewhat, though not very true for protein, and not at all true for fats. When you eat any amount of fat, and it is not being currently burned for energy, it is stored as adipose tissue. On top of minimal amounts of fats that you need, there is no really added hormonal benefit of high fat intake, and any extra fats you eat that are hypercaloric will go and get stored as fat. If you eat extra carbohydrate, all those same things happen, but you also get an enhanced secretion of insulin because carbohydrates are little mini insulin secretors, especially when taken over time. Over the course of a day, over the course of days, weeks, and months, a higher level of insulin secretion, combined with the presence of testosterone in normal, healthy male and female, and the presence of resistance training, is an anabolic combination towards muscle tissue. It is also anabolic towards fat tissue, but we got to remember that eating excessive amounts of fat is really just kind of anabolic towards fat tissue, while eating excessive amounts of carbohydrates is anabolic to both muscle and fat. So in bodybuilders, there is a good idea about maybe if you're going to eat most of your calories from some source, for sure protein is still the most important, gram per pound, but it's probably a good idea to stay towards that minimum amount of fat, maybe not at it, but close, and get the preponderance of your calories from carbohydrates. It's what Broderick likes to call an oppressive amount of carbohydrate. I've been experimenting with that kind of diet recently, so I have a number of my friends and colleagues. It's like what you would call, bro-style clean eating or whatever. It doesn't have to be clean. We're not like dusting the food off with brushes or anything like that. But, it could still be tasty food. It just has to be relatively low in fat, high in protein, and very high in carb. And the kind of eating is really difficult because, Jesus Christ, there's only so much rice you can eat until you're like, I see another grain of rice, I'm going to blow up. Rice is going to go everywhere. Take me to a party, hang me up, I'll be a piñata. Only rice comes out. Sorry, folks, no candy. But that's the only thing I can left to do here. It is tough. However, when combined with resistance training and an effective program, it seems to probably give a little bit of a muscle growth edge to higher fat, low carbohydrate intake, even above and beyond the minimum intake of carbohydrate. With for hard training bodybuilders, you got at least 1.5 grams per pound of body weight per day, probably more like at least 2. But I think that once you've met those minima, I think that there may be an additional benefit from reducing fat intake and increasing carbohydrate intake to a high extent. It's difficult psychologically, but there's all kinds of fun sort of lower fat, high carb foods. Thank God for baked Lay's potato chips. If they would sponsor me, I would gladly take the sponsorship for no money at all. I would just advocate for them for free. But that's neither here nor there. So that may be a better recommendation for bodybuilders, is to try to really push the carb content. Whereas for someone like a powerlifter in a strength phase, there's no need to smash carbs down your throat. So if you like a jar of peanut butter fits into your macros a day, have at it. Really, strongmen and powerlifters have the most fun out of all of us. Everyone else is on some kind of weird diet, and powerlifters are eating fuck all and still getting strong.
Right. So I'm assuming most of those recommendations would stay consistent, but if someone was switching from a strength to a hypertrophy phase, would they want to adjust maybe protein intake to account for that?
So I think protein intake can stay relatively stable, although you can get away with eating less protein on a strength phase than on a hypertrophy phase, for sure, because the amount of protein turnover is less.
Sure.
But I think protein, so the gram per pound is just so easy to remember, and it's not that tough to get in. And if you just get almost that much, you're good to go. I think the biggest change from hypertrophy phase or strength phase to hypertrophy phase is you're now expending much more energy.
Okay.
And you are burning much more glycogen, and you need more carbohydrate. So whereas you could eat more fat and fewer carbs, and that would be totally fine in a strength phase. When you get into a hypertrophy phase, you probably should be eating at the very least more carbs, maybe less fats as well, but mostly just more carbs. So, great, good thing about hypertrophy phase: if you like to eat, hypertrophy phase is your best friend.
Right. Okay. Awesome. And now to get to the last section I have here, which is just like a little bit of extra insight into the best piece of advice that you've ever received.
Holy shit. Best piece of advice that I've ever received.
Yeah.
So my grandma, who's Russian, because I'm Russian also, she once told me, "Сделал дело, гуляй смело," which means once you've finished your tasks, or in this case, literally your task, you can sort of, walk around and enjoy leisure activities freely, which really is, so the colloquial translation of that is get your shit done, and then you can relax and have fun afterwards. And it almost, the translation is like, you can relax confidently. I find that probably the biggest factor in my success, outside of genetic factors and things outside of my control, is the fact that I'm very good about getting my work done, and then relaxing versus trying to intersperse the two. Like when I wake up in the morning, I either have to start working or go train, or I'm not fun to be around. Once I've gotten the duties of the day done, I don't need to get high because I'm basically high all the time, just being like an idiot. But I got to get the work done first because it really helps me both, check that off the list, do a good job while I have a lot of energy, and it also doesn't weigh on me later. It sounds like the stupidest, simplest advice you give to a child. In fact, it was. But I think a lot of people, especially when they get really good at doing work, and they're gifted intellectually, they go to college and they find that they can watch episodes of Seinfeld and do some homework between, the commercial breaks and still get shit done. I think sitting down, focusing on your task, really reading, really learning, really writing, really thinking for a real good block of time. Get a water break and pee breaks every now and again, and a snack whenever you need, but really getting to it, really getting the task done, doing a lot of good quality work lets you open up a level of depth and a level of accomplishment that is really superlative. And then after that, you've accumulated quite a bit of fatigue, you've worked really hard. You owe it to yourself, for longevity purposes and for the purposes of being productive tomorrow and next week, to really decompress. So then, when I relax, I mean, my God, here's the extent of my intellectual compartmentalization. Currently for RP, I'm writing books and doing lectures, and I think about deep shit pretty much all the time while I'm at work. Really deep shit that challenges me intellectually at a high level. When I'm relaxing, I don't like to watch dramas because they make me think. I don't like crime movies because they make me think. I want dumb shit. I watch Justice League cartoons. 8-year-olds can understand the morality behind that. I want Superman beating people up, faces exploding. That's it. Because that's my time to relax, and not interested in thinking recreationally. Now, people have to take it to that extreme. Of course not. But I think that getting your work done, having distinct times in the day or in the week to get your shit done, and then having distinct times to really let free, let go, have fun, relax, that's the way to both being super productive and sustainably so. Because if you try to mix the two together, you kind of dilute both of them. The quality of your work suffers, and you're never quite relaxed. You know what I mean? It's like bringing homework on a camping trip. It fucking sucks. First of all, you're going to do shit in your homework because your bird's going to shit on your homework, or you're going to slap an insect onto the paper, or where are you going to charge your laptop, shit like that. And on the other hand, people are over there, bonging beers, and you're fucking finishing up your homework. That sucks, right? So it ruins everything. And I think in the adult world, in the working world, it works much the same way. So I think get your shit done, and then relax. And when you do relax, really fucking let loose. And it's really easy to relax once you've worked hard. That's also another cool benefit. For those who really have tendencies to be really kind of workaholics, once you've really worked really, really hard, your brain's so tired you don't need to people that say oh, you're overthinking things. I'm never at risk of overthinking shit after 8 hours of writing textbooks. I have no idea what the hell's going on, don't care, and it's super fun, and the next morning I wake up and I repeat the cycle.
So do you think there's a certain environment that is more conducive to getting work done and being less distracted?
Holy shit, absolutely. Now, some people have pretty big tolerances for distractions. I grew up with attention deficit disorder, so my tolerance for distractions historically has been like negative. But nowadays I'm a little better at it, but I still prefer a very quiet workplace, very few distractions where I can really think clearly. Sometimes this is some next level shit, but I'll work with earplugs in.
Okay.
I can't hear anything. And I stare at a computer screen and I design graphs of relationships and write really complex concepts. And I have these moments of like almost like sublime elation at how purely focused my creativity and my thoughts are. And it's kind of like a sort of like an isolation chamber. You don't have to do that, but I'll tell you this: if you're trying to do really deep intellectual, high quality work, and there's a bunch of bullshit happening around you, people yelling and shit, and TV's on, there's just a quality of work that you're probably with an average ability to focus not going to be able to do. Now, some people can focus fucking anywhere. I'm jealous of those people. I always will be beyond any reasonable level, but most people don't fall into that category. So I'll put it to you this way: as far as general advice, get the level of isolation, calm, and sort of less distraction that you need to do what you consider high quality work. And when you can do that, and you can do that repeatedly, great. Like when I went to undergrad, I would go to the library, to the stacks, where there's these little rooms where there's like skeletons of students who died like studying for the exams. You just like move the skeleton over and you sit in motherfucker's place. I'm joking mostly, I think, although I'm sure that's happened. So you go to the stacks, there's no noise, there's nothing. It's literally like you're not allowed to make noise in the library. Boy, do you get some good work done. Then you go back to the dorms, and there's co-ed dorms. It's a shit show 100% of the time. And then you have fun. But if you try to do homework at the dorms, you can do it. If you can do it, great. But you got to admit to yourself, and there's nothing wrong with admitting to yourself that you can't do it. This is a story I heard. I'm not sure if it's true. It's just it's a cool story anyway, whether or not it's true. But I think it's true. I've heard it passed down. My understanding is Albert Einstein had all of his clothes hung up before the week started in his closet. So he'd simply take them out and put them on so that he didn't have to spend time or mental energy thinking about what he was going to wear, because he was only concerned with the theory of everything at that point. So, if Einstein has to do weird shit like that, don't feel like you're like a handicap case because you have to go to the library to study. Do what it takes to get away from what you need to, get your work done, and then come back and shit. Hey, when you got your work done and you're getting good grades, college is fun. And just don't take too many drugs at the same time. Take them one at a time and then lower doses and you'll be great.
Yeah, for some reason when you were talking about how you felt when you were just deeply involved in your work, I could just picture Arnold Schwarzenegger and pumping iron. And you're coming inside of the gym, you're coming while you're working, you're coming while you're relaxing.
You know what? But for me, that's actually a disorder. I'm literally ejaculating at all times. It's gotten me into trouble before. I have an exemption from the police now, that when I'm coming on the bus and people are like, "Oh my god!" And the police get called. I'm like, "Hey guys, it's me again." They're like, "Oh, sorry, Dr. Mike. Please continue on with your ridiculous disorder."
That's awesome. Okay, so another question I have is, what is the craziest feat of athleticism or strength you've ever witnessed, and then also who has the greatest physique, either past or present?
Man, that I've ever witnessed in person, or
just in general, but I guess in person would kind of limit it a bit more.
Yeah. I saw Andy Bolton break the at the time deadlift world record by pulling 971 pounds, about 12 feet in front of my face. He picked up 971 pounds off the ground and stood with it for 3 seconds and then put it back down. That didn't make any fucking sense. And I remember coming up, so obviously it was the last deadlift of the meet, and everyone was cheering, celebrating, and they kind of moved off the platform. I walked onto the platforms, nobody gave a shit anymore, and of course that weight was still loaded, right? And that weight sat there and it hit me, and I think I've told the story before elsewhere, but it's just, I could retell the story fucking every other hour. I walked up to it and I looked at that weight, 971 pounds, and I realized there was not a human on earth that could lift that. Nobody could, except for that one guy right there. Think about that.
Yeah, that's mind-blowing.
Because, like, you go to some meet and the last deadlift's like 500 pounds, some huge guy in the back can come up and, like, pick it up because he's coached other lifters and shit. Like, Chad Wesley Smith could just, like, pick up 500 without a warm-up, no problem. So, like, when someone puts down their last 500-pound deadlift, they're like, yeah, I won the meet, yeah. You're like, okay, that's great. Hey, you're strong and shit, but, like, whatever, right? But that weight is literally unliftable. And everyone was WPO Super Finals. Everyone in the room is jacked. Nobody can do that. It was just mind-boggling.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Physique? Did you ask about physique also?
Yes.
Same physique, Andy Bolton. I'm totally
really.
kidding. That'd be pretty.
Oh, wow.
No, I'm just kidding. Good guy. All due respect to Andy Bolton. He's a power lifter. Man, you're putting me on the spot. I wonder what Broderick would say. Can I give multiple answers?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there is a beauty to Flex Wheeler's physique, which I've never seen replicated, nor has anyone ever. Mm-hmm. Flex Wheeler wasn't the leanest guy. He didn't even have the freakiest proportions. Like, he didn't have the smallest waist ever. And he was definitely not the biggest. But his combination of body parts and their shapes was magical. Like, Flex Wheeler walked on a stage, and you're like, what the fuck? Why don't I look like that? I'll never look like that. No one is a sculpture. Flex Wheeler may be one of the only people who's ever looked better than the caricature statue they give you when you win a show. Like, the ridiculous, like, trophy they give you where the guy's glutes are basically on his face and it's, like, flawless and he's got, like, a 23-inch waist and 80-inch quads. Flex Wheeler looked better than that guy. It's just aesthetically better. Like, I think Flex Wheeler's the kind of physique that if, you take some of his more classic shots and you send them back in time to the Renaissance era, they would be like, that is a beautiful physique. Mm-hmm. So I think Flex Wheeler takes the cake. I don't want to look like Flex Wheeler. Sure as hell isn't in the cards for me. I don't even prefer that look. I just think there's something jaw-dropping about it that transcends all eras. But I have to mention that one of my favorite looks ever was a bodybuilder he's still around as a coach, he's a great coach, Dennis James. And he has stepped on stage in the 260s at about 5'8".
Wow.
And I think at one point his upper pecs were so big, I didn't know how he didn't choke himself with the shit. I had no idea. I look at his body, I'm like, how does he move in real life? How does he shower? How does he literally touch his own thigh? Like, I have no idea how that works because everything's in the way. There were some off-season pictures of him one year in, like, 2002 that were just, like, absurd. They were just comical. It was like, this is a joke. This is really a person. Ever since then, I've, like, wanted to be super jacked because I remember staring at pictures of him for hours and just trying to figure out how someone could be that fucking gigantic. It was like a religious experience.
So what are your thoughts on Big Ramy?
Amazing. Same thoughts. Yeah. I've stared at big pictures of Big Ramy for longer than he would be comfortable watching me stare at pictures of him. I'll put it to you that way. So that's actually a good metric. I got to remember that for later. Big Ramy is it's the second coming, man. I mean, and the thing about Big Ramy is that he doesn't have a big waist. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense. He's actually aesthetic while having shoulders the size of, like, steering wheels. Like, his triceps, I don't even know what the fuck is in there. His quads, the thing about him is he has got this really trippy thing going on where he's not aesthetic. Mm-hmm. He's pretty aesthetic, which is crazy at 320 pounds. And he's also relatively balanced. Like, you could make an advanced critique that his back is not up to par with the rest of him, but, like, everything else really is. He has big calves, big quads, big hams, big glutes, big shoulders, big arms, big chest. There's nothing really lagging. You know what I mean?
Right. So do you think he's gonna win the Olympia soon?
My prediction for the Olympia is the incumbent, because statistically I would have to be fucking insane and unfamiliar with mathematics to ever predict anyone other than the incumbent winning. The incumbent wins almost every single time. Phil Heath is a dangerous motherfucker, and I've seen people discount him every year. Kai Green. Yeah. Kai Green's a great bodybuilder. He's phenomenal. Phil Heath. I've seen Phil Heath in person at, I think, the 2013 Mr. Olympia compete against Kai Green, and as soon as he walked out, Nick Shaw and I looked at each other and we're like, Mr. Olympia. That's it. Like, he's bigger in person than in pictures, which, if that makes any sense, and is also incredibly aesthetic, and he's almost always the leanest guy in the show. It's what people don't mention about him, is that he's bone dry. And that combination of size, symmetry, and dryness is just too much. There's nothing about him that any one of those things is unbelievable, although his conditioning is top notch. It's the combination that's just like, all right, like this is tough to deal with. My prediction is still Phil Heath.
Okay.
However, if I was Phil Heath, I would be uncomfortable about the Big Ramy situation. So if I saw pictures recently of Big Ramy and I was Phil Heath, I'd be like, noted, right? Got to really dig into my prep, because Big Ramy is a discomforting figure in bodybuilding. It's like, I imagine Lee Haney kind of looked at Dorian Yates like that in 1992. Like, I better get the fuck out of here before this guy figures this shit out. Now, I'm sure Lee Haney didn't actually think that. But it's one of those things where it's certainly a contender. Absolutely. I'll put it to you this way. If Big Ramy wins, I'd be the last person to be surprised by that.
Okay. And the last question here before we wrap up.
Sure.
What are some resources in and out of the fitness world that you would recommend to all listeners?
Oh, they only need one: Renaissance Periodization, man.
Yeah.
And listen, I really need money. So if you guys want to send me actual PayPal, like just amounts of money, whatever you could spare, I'd love that, because I need a new Bugatti. The old one, it just doesn't fit. It's designed for small people. I don't get it. On a serious note, RenaissancePeriodization.com is a cool resource, but there are very many others. I would really, really check out Examine.com. That's a great resource for supplement claims. They have basically every supplement ever researched on there, with all the studies they've ever done, and kind of like a conclusion there, like, is this a good idea or not? Mm-hmm. I think another unbelievable website, I can't believe it doesn't get any more shares than it does, is strengthandconditioningresearch.com. I believe it's run by a couple of gentlemen. I think Brett Contreras might also run that. I'm not sure. But it's a phenomenal site that just does basically comprehensive literature reviews on basically every subject in strength and conditioning: power training, plyometric training, hypertrophy training. Really, really, really great stuff. Those two websites come to mind. There's a ton of others. There's a Facebook group called Smart Training and Flexible Dieting that a gentleman named Antonis Diamano runs, and I would join that because there's always really awesome articles being exchanged there, really, really great discussions about advanced concepts and all things fitness, nutrition, training. I would say, as far as following people, there's too many to list, but you should probably follow Greg Nuckols. Mm-hmm. You should probably follow Alan Aragon, Brad Schoenfeld, Krieger, Helms, all those guys. Super, super swell people, always putting out good stuff. And for kind of more intermediate individuals, novice to intermediate, just getting into things, I think Steve Hall and Revive Stronger, those two things on Instagram and on Facebook and on the podcasts and stuff, is really a good resource to get people up to speed on a lot of really basic concepts to diet and training, put in like a really, really good, simple way, because sometimes some of the other resources are pretty advanced.
Sure.
And, if you're like, don't know much what's going on, you start following Greg Nuckols right away, you're like, holy shit, first of all, this guy's an IQ of like 100 trillion. And second, I have no fucking clue what he's saying because I don't understand any of these terms. If you follow someone, like Steve Hall and Revive Stronger, you can come up to speed on those basic terms. And then you start following Greg, you're like, some of this now makes sense.
Sure. And anything sort of outside of the fitness world that you would recommend, maybe in a different field?
Well, I'd be committing the intellectual fallacy thinking that I have expertise outside the field then. I don't know. As far as this general thinking and cool stuff, I've read almost every single book the economist and philosopher Thomas Sowell has put out. I think everything he says is pretty much fucking gold. He's probably smarter than you. He's probably smarter than me. And good luck making sense of anything he says. But it's always put in such a way that easy for us plebeians to understand. And Sam Harris, I'm not sure if you know who that is.
Yeah.
I listen to as much Sam Harris as I can get to. So when I walk to the gym, when I walk back, I listen to a lot of Sam Harris. I've been catching Dave Rubin a lot on YouTube lately. He's talking about a lot of political correctness, freedom of speech type of stuff. It's super cool. He just seems like a cool guy. I'd like to meet Dave Rubin and just be like, hey, you're the man. It's just kind of awkward. But those are kind of my... I could recommend Jordan Peterson, but I think everyone's already heard of Jordan Peterson.
Does it ever weird you out that people consider you the equivalent to what you consider Sam Harris?
Yeah, especially in person, I don't. Is trippy. I don't know. It's not a negative thing. It's kind of just a trip. So like,
Yeah.
I was at the CrossFit Games with Nick Shaw recently, just a week ago, and people would stop us and be like, "Oh my God, you guys are RP," and we're like, "Yes, hello," and they're like, "Can we get a picture with you?" And I'm like, always thinking like, "What the fuck would you want a picture with me? Like, who the fuck am I?" But and sometimes they just stare and they're like, "Wow," and they expect you to say something cool, and I'm like, ball sacks, vaginas, and that's all I can say. And they're like, "Whoa, you're fucking weird and funny, and say something smart." And I'm like, "Oh man, I don't know if it works like that." But so yeah, it's a trip. It's definitely an interesting experience. I'm just stupid humble brag bullshit coming up, but I'm just trying to figure stuff out and help people figure their shit out. One of the number one reasons I'm in this sort of public intellectual role is because when I was coming up, we didn't really have the internet so much, and I just believed so much dumb shit for so long, in lifting especially, that I'm pissed and still pissed. So if anyone can find individuals, I'm one of many, probably not even the best one as far as what we do, people like Greg and Alan and Brad, etc., that are so good at translating these complex concepts in individuals like yourself running podcasts and stuff. Like, I wish I had you guys around
Sure.
when I was growing up. So I'm just trying to do my best to kind of offer up knowledge to those that are interested in it. And I think that's going to make us all better off. And the more important thing is it's going to make me fucking rich, because that's really the only reason I'm doing all this shit, man. I don't want to drive a Bugatti. I want to be able to crash a Bugatti and walk away and be like, I don't even give a shit because I have 5 of those at home.
Yeah, well, speaking for all of my listeners and myself, we really appreciate it. The last thing, you've already plugged your site and a few of the products, but is there anything else you'd like to discuss that you have coming up for the listeners?
Yeah, sure. So we're currently writing, Dr. Hoffman, who's my sort of most collaborative colleague and one of my best friends. We're writing a book on the volume concepts: minimum effective volume, maximum recoverable volume, and everything in between. We're writing a whole more or less a textbook, kind of like an exploratory work on that. It's going to be hundreds of pages. It's going to be super cool, really deep theory stuff. Right after that is released, very likely we are going to release finally the recovery book. So it's going to be we had a diet book, we have a strength training book, and now it's going to be the recovery book. It's probably going to be called something fancier. If I was selling it, I'd just call it recovery book, but that's why Nick Shaw doesn't let me name things anymore. Those are 2 big things in the pipe, and I think that hopefully within the next several months to half a year, we'll have the rewrite of the Renaissance diet, which is going to be beefy. It's going to be huge. It's going to be overgrown. It's going to be the big Raimi of books, to where you look at it and you're like, holy shit, how is that real? That's what's coming down the pipe for us. We're working super hard so that you can work harder and more productively.
Awesome.
There it is.
And thank you so much again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.